The morning sun poured through the glass walls of Los Angeles International Airport. Travelers hurried past one another. Businessmen clutching laptops, families guiding sleepy children, the usual airport chaos. Amid the rush, Steven Seagal moved quietly, dressed simply in dark jeans, a leather jacket, and sunglasses. No entourage, no noise, just a man traveling home after a charity event. He checked in early, carrying only a small bag and a first-class boarding pass. Even though many still recognized his name, Steven had long learned to enjoy anonymity. He took his seat in first class, nodded politely to the attendants, and began scrolling through his phone. A few minutes later, a sharply dressed white businessman entered the cabin, glancing at Steven's seat before frowning. "Excuse me," he said loudly, holding out his ticket. "You're in my seat." Steven looked up calmly, checked his boarding pass again, and replied softly, "No, I think we have the same number." "Maybe a system error." The businessman turned toward a flight attendant. "Can you please fix this? I paid for this seat." The young attendant looked uneasy. She checked the screen, then Steven's pass, then the other man's. "Sir," she said to Steven, "it seems there's a duplicate seat number. Could you please step out while we sort this out?" Steven frowned slightly. "I've already checked in. My ticket was confirmed hours ago." Before she could answer, another crew member joined her, older, more assertive. "Sir," he said, his tone clipped, "we'll handle this quickly. Please step outside." Passengers nearby began to notice. A woman whispered, "Isn't that Steven Seagal?" Another man raised his phone, quietly recording. Steven stood slowly, his towering frame almost intimidating in its calmness. He handed over his phone, showing the digital ticket. "Please check carefully," he said, but the supervisor barely glanced at it. "Sir, this gentleman has priority status. Please cooperate." The businessman crossed his arms, waiting smugly as Steven was escorted out of the cabin. The quiet in first class was heavy. A few passengers exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others curious. As the door closed behind him, one thing was clear. Steven Seagal had just been removed from first class for a white passenger. But what Steven did next made the entire airline regret everything. Steven stood just outside the aircraft door, beside the boarding tunnel. The cold air from the terminal hit his face as he tried to stay composed. Around him, a few staff members whispered hurriedly into their radios, their voices low but tense. He could have demanded attention, could have raised his voice or used his fame, but he didn't. Years of discipline had taught him that power didn't always come from shouting. It came from control. The younger attendant returned holding a tablet. "Sir," she said nervously, "we're just checking something." "It seems there's been a mix-up." Steven nodded slowly. "I understand. But I'd appreciate being treated with the same respect as anyone else." She hesitated before replying. "Of course, sir." Just then the businessman from earlier appeared behind her, clearly agitated. "Is he still here?" He snapped. "I have a meeting in New York. Can we please get this sorted?" "I paid for that seat." Steven's eyes met his, calm, unwavering. "And so did I." The man scoffed, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." Two more airline staff members joined in. One of them, a senior-looking ground officer, looked Steven up and down, his expression changing from confusion to irritation. "Sir, this is taking too long. We can rebook you on another flight or move you to a seat in business class if you prefer." Steven blinked slowly. "You're asking me to give up a seat I already paid for?" The officer crossed his arms. "Let's be reasonable. It's just a seat." "Just a seat?" Steven replied quietly, his deep voice carrying a weight that made the man pause. "Respect isn't just anything." The ground officer looked momentarily uncomfortable, then straightened. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." People at the gate had started to gather. Some recognized him. Phones were out, recording the entire scene. Whispered voices rippled through the waiting area. "That's Steven Seagal." "Why are they kicking him out?" "Wait, what's going on?" A woman in line shook her head. "That's not right." He was sitting there first. Steven noticed the growing attention. He didn't want a spectacle, but he also knew silence could be mistaken for weakness. He took a step closer to the officer and said evenly, "I've done everything by the book. I checked in early, followed every instruction, and now you're asking me to leave my seat because someone looks like they belong there more than I do." The officer stiffened. "No one said that, sir." "You didn't have to," Steven said softly. The tension thickened. The businessman glanced around uncomfortably now, realizing the crowd's eyes were no longer friendly. A few people murmured words of support toward Steven. One bystander called out, "You're profiling him." "That's not right," another added. "He's being polite. Why are you treating him like that?" The younger attendant looked torn, whispering to her supervisor, "Sir, maybe we should double-check the manifest." But the older officer waved her off. "We'll handle it." Steven stood there silently, arms folded, unshaken. The standoff was now fully public. Every second that passed, more phones were lifted into the air. He finally said, "If this is how your airline treats people, then maybe it's time someone sees it." His words were quiet, but they hit harder than a shout. The officer glanced nervously at the cameras now surrounding them. His voice softened slightly. "Sir, please, let us fix this." Steven nodded once. "That's all I asked for." Minutes passed before anyone moved. The attendant disappeared into the plane again, checking passenger data while Steven waited silently, the crowd around him thick with whispers and sympathy. It was no longer a private misunderstanding. It was a public humiliation. The waiting area outside Gate 14 had grown tense. What began as a quiet disagreement was now a full-blown scene. Dozens of travelers had gathered, whispering, filming, and trying to understand why Steven Seagal, a global movie star, was being treated like a random passenger with no rights. Steven stood motionless near the counter. His tall frame, calm presence, and deliberate silence seemed to make the airline staff even more uneasy. The businessman still lingered nearby, pretending to check his phone, occasionally throwing impatient glances at Steven. "Sir," the ground officer said finally, tapping on his tablet, "we've rechecked the manifest. It appears there was an error in the system. However, this gentleman has executive platinum status. Our policy gives him seat priority." Steven's jaw tightened. "So because he's a frequent flyer, my confirmed ticket doesn't matter?" The officer shifted. "That's how the system works, sir. We can issue you a voucher and seat you in business class." Steven looked down for a moment, exhaled slowly, and then lifted his gaze. "I'm not asking for favors," he said evenly. "Just fairness." The younger attendant, clearly uncomfortable, tried to speak. "Maybe we can—" but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, please let me handle this." Steven's calm began to wear thin. Years of discipline kept his voice low, but there was steel in it now. "You're handling it badly," he said. "And you're doing it in front of everyone." A murmur swept through the crowd. Several passengers had begun voicing support. "Let the man have his seat. He's right, it's not about upgrades, it's about respect." The businessman huffed. "This is ridiculous. He's making a scene." Steven turned his head slightly. "I haven't raised my voice once," he said, "but I won't be humiliated for someone else's convenience." At that, a few people applauded softly. The officer's expression darkened. "Sir, please control yourself." Steven looked at him unmoved. "Control is all I've shown since you asked me to step off that plane." The tension in the air thickened. A mother nearby held her child close, whispering, "That's so unfair." Someone else muttered, "They wouldn't treat a white celebrity like that." The officer spoke again, more defensive now. "If you refuse to comply, we'll have to involve airport security." Steven straightened. His tone was quiet but firm. "Do what you have to." "I'm not resisting. I'm standing my ground." The attendant looked pale now. "Sir, please," she said softly. "Let me check again." She rushed off, clearly shaken by how the situation had spiraled. Steven didn't move. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, expression unreadable. Around him, the whispers turned to murmurs, the murmurs to soft outrage. They're in the wrong. He's showing them what real discipline looks like. If this was anyone else, they'd have called it discrimination. Within minutes, airport security arrived, 2 uniformed officers who looked uncertain about what they were walking into. The ground officer quickly approached them, explaining the situation in a low voice. The security officers glanced toward Steven, recognizing him instantly. One of them leaned toward the other. "That's Steven Seagal," he muttered. The other nodded. "Yeah, I'm not putting hands on him." They approached carefully. "Sir," the first officer said respectfully, "we're told there's a ticketing issue." Steven nodded once. "That's what they call it." The guard exchanged a look with the flight attendant who looked ready to cry. "Let's double-check before making any decision," he said. By now, nearly everyone in the boarding area had stopped pretending to mind their own business. Cameras were recording openly. Every word, every expression was being captured. The ground officer began to sweat. The businessman, seeing the growing attention, looked less confident now. He adjusted his tie, mumbling something about bad service. Steven finally spoke again, quietly but with a sharp edge that cut through the noise. "I've spent my life standing up for respect. I'm not starting to bow today." The security officers didn't move. The crowd applauded lightly again, a ripple of support spreading through the area. It was clear that this situation was no longer about a seat. It was about principle, and for the first time the airline staff began to realize they had picked the wrong man to dismiss. If you were standing there watching this unfold, would you step in or stay silent? Type your answer in the comments below. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. The gate area had become an impromptu theater, every eye fixed on the tall, calm man standing his ground against an airline that clearly didn't realize who they were dealing with. Steven Seagal hadn't raised his voice once, yet somehow his quiet presence commanded the room. The ground officer still looked uneasy, flipping through his tablet, muttering about protocol and seat priority. The businessman, arms folded, avoided the eyes of the growing crowd, and then, almost too quietly to notice at first, a voice from the back said, "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal?" Heads turned. A teenager holding his phone up zoomed in for a closer look. "Dude," he whispered to his friend, "that's him. The Steven Seagal." His friend blinked. "No way." "Are you serious?" Within seconds, whispers spread through the crowd like sparks catching fire. "That's him. The movie guy, the martial artist. He used to be a cop too, right?" The recognition rippled forward until the passengers near the counter started murmuring too. Some began recording even more intensely, angling their phones to capture his face clearly. The flight attendant who had been nervously standing by finally realized who she was speaking to. Her eyes widened slightly, her breath catching. She leaned toward the ground officer and whispered, "Sir, I think that's Steven Seagal." The officer frowned, irritated. "I don't care who he is, this is about our rules." But his voice wavered now, uncertain. The crowd was no longer neutral. A middle-aged man stepped forward and said loudly, "You're embarrassing yourselves." "That man is a national icon," another passenger chimed in. "He's being respectful, why are you still pushing him around?" The officer looked around, realizing he was losing control of the situation. Cameras everywhere, murmurs growing louder. Steven stayed motionless, still as stone, his arms folded loosely. He hadn't confirmed his identity, hadn't tried to use fame as leverage. That wasn't his style. He simply said, "It doesn't matter who I am. This shouldn't happen to anyone." The crowd reacted instantly. Someone shouted, "He's right." Another added, "You'd never treat a businessman like this if he didn't look ordinary." The businessman, now sweating, took a nervous step back. He glanced at Steven's calm expression, then at the crowd, realizing his earlier smugness had backfired. The security officers shifted uncomfortably. One leaned toward the other and muttered, "We should probably check with headquarters before this blows up online." Meanwhile, the flight attendants began whispering to each other. The young woman who had been kind from the start finally approached Steven quietly. "Sir, I'm so sorry for all this," she said softly. "We're just following what the system shows, but I believe you." Steven gave a slight nod. "You're doing your job," he said. "But sometimes doing the right thing isn't the same as doing what you're told." Her eyes glistened, and she nodded back silently. At that moment, someone from the back of the crowd yelled, "Hey, look, he's trending." People began checking their phones. Clips of the confrontation were already circulating on social media, captioned, "Steven Seagal kicked out of first class for no reason. Airline embarrasses action star in public." The gate officer froze when he saw passengers scrolling through the footage. It had already spread far beyond the airport walls. The businessman muttered something about bad press and quietly stepped aside, pretending to take a call. The once dismissive tone of the airline staff began to change. Their voices softened, their posture shifted from authority to caution. Still, Steven said nothing more. He stood firm, letting the silence speak for him. The young teen who first recognized him whispered to his phone camera, "He's not even mad. He's just calm." That's real strength. And as that line hit social media later, it would define the entire story. For now, though, inside that terminal, the shift had begun. The power dynamic had flipped, not through anger, but through quiet truth. Everyone knew it. Everyone could feel it, and deep down, even the airline staff knew. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The gate area had fallen into a strange electric quiet. Everyone knew by now, the man they dismissed, the one they'd asked to step aside for someone more important, was Steven Seagal. The videos spreading online were already hitting thousands of views by the minute. Yet there he stood, unmoved, unshaken and silent, even as the crowd's whispers grew louder. The ground officer, red-faced and visibly nervous, cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, his tone softer now, "we've spoken to our operations team. There's still a bit of confusion about the seat, but we'd like to offer." Steven raised his hand slightly. The officer stopped mid-sentence. "I don't need an offer," Steven said evenly. "I just need honesty." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried through the gate like a command. Calm, steady, unapologetically firm. The officer blinked. "Sir, I understand." "No," Steven interrupted. "You don't." He took one step forward. "When I checked in, you saw a man in plain clothes and decided something about me. You didn't see a customer. You saw a profile." The crowd was utterly silent. Even the children had stopped talking. Steven continued, his tone respectful but powerful. "You didn't ask for facts. You didn't check the system. You just assumed the man in the suit deserved more respect than the man who looked ordinary." He looked around slowly, meeting the eyes of the people watching. "That's not an airline problem. That's a people problem." The officer swallowed hard, eyes flicking nervously toward the crowd, recording every word. Steven glanced toward the businessman, who now looked thoroughly embarrassed. "You," he said calmly, "did nothing wrong by asking for your seat. But when you saw what was happening, you stayed quiet. Silence is easy when it's not your dignity being taken." The man lowered his eyes, unable to respond. Steven turned back to the officer. "I don't want compensation. I don't want apologies rehearsed by public relations. I just want you to remember that every person who steps on your plane deserves the same respect, whether they're wearing a suit, a robe, or jeans." A few passengers started clapping softly. Then more joined in. Within seconds, the entire gate erupted in applause. Some stood up, phones still rolling, while others simply nodded in quiet agreement. The ground officer's face was pale now. "Mr. Seagal, I didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered. "We were just—" Steven lifted a hand again, stopping him. "It's not about meaning," he said. "It's about awareness." The younger attendant, the one who had treated him with decency from the start, looked on the verge of tears. She whispered, "Sir, I'm so sorry." Steven gave a faint smile. "You did fine." You listened. The clapping grew louder. People cheered his calm strength. Someone shouted, "That's how you handle disrespect with grace." The businessman stepped forward finally, looking at Steven. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have said something sooner." Steven nodded once, accepting it without bitterness. Doing the right thing late is still better than never. By now, security officers were exchanging uneasy glances. They hadn't expected a confrontation like this, one that didn't end in shouting or threats, but in quiet truth that made everyone rethink what they'd just witnessed. The officer lowered his head slightly. "We'll make this right." "Sir," he said. Steven looked around at the faces, travelers, families, employees, all frozen in that moment between guilt and admiration. Then he spoke one final line, one that would replay across every platform in the hours to come. "Respect isn't a privilege. It's the minimum we owe each other." The gate fell utterly silent. Then, a wave of applause thundered across the terminal. For a brief moment, everyone felt the power of humility and principle, embodied not in anger, but in calm, measured truth, and in that instant, Steven Seagal's stand became bigger than a seat on a plane. It became a statement. Do you think Steven did the right thing by standing his ground, or should he have just walked away quietly? Tell us your opinion in the comments below. The echo of applause slowly faded into murmurs. The crowd's energy had shifted entirely from awkward silence to admiration. Steven Seagal didn't gloat, didn't bask in the attention. He just stood there, composed, arms relaxed at his sides, eyes calm as ever. Then through the corner of his vision, Steven saw movement at the end of the gate. A senior airline officer, crisp uniform, silver name badge, was rushing toward the scene, clearly briefed about the commotion. As the officer arrived, he took in the tense faces, the cameras, the crowd, and then he froze. Recognition flashed instantly in his eyes. "Mr. Seagal?" he said, startled. "Steven Seagal?" Steven nodded once, quietly. The man's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief and then to something close to panic. "Oh my God. Sir, we didn't realize. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." The crowd erupted with whispers again. The ground officer who had confronted Steven earlier looked stunned, color draining from his face. The senior officer turned sharply to him. "You didn't check properly?" he demanded. He didn't show ID at first and there was a duplicate." "That's not the point," the senior officer snapped. "This man's ticket was valid, verified. You removed him without cause." The businessman tried to step in, voice shaky. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this." The senior officer ignored him completely, focusing on Steven. "Sir, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize. Please allow us to correct this immediately. Your original seat is available. You'll be reboarded at once." Steven studied him for a long moment. The tone was respectful, the apology genuine. But the damage had already been done. He didn't raise his voice, didn't humiliate anyone. He simply asked, "Would you have apologized if no one started recording?" The senior officer hesitated, throat tightening. "Sir," he began, then stopped. There was no safe answer. Steven continued quietly. "Mistakes happen. But how quickly we recognize them shows what kind of people we are." The ground officer finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Mr. Seagal, I didn't—" Steven turned his gaze toward him. "You didn't have to know my name to treat me right," he said. "You just had to look at me as a person." That line hit harder than anything else that day. The crowd went silent again, realizing this wasn't about celebrity anymore. It was about basic humanity. The senior officer cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, please, let us escort you back to your seat. The captain is aware and waiting to greet you personally." Steven nodded once but didn't move yet. Instead, he turned slightly toward the passengers watching from the seating area. "Folks," he said softly, "I appreciate the support. But this shouldn't only matter because my name is known. What about the people who don't have cameras on them? Who doesn't have a million followers to make noise for them?" You could have heard a pin drop. The crowd's eyes softened, admiration now mixed with reflection. Steven stepped forward, ready to reboard. As he did, he placed a hand briefly on the younger attendant's shoulder. "You did fine," he said gently. "Never lose that instinct to care." She smiled, tears forming. "Thank you, sir." The senior officer gestured for Steven to follow him down the jet bridge. But before stepping inside, Steven turned one last time to face the crowd and said, "Respect shouldn't depend on recognition. If it does, it's not respect, it's performance." With that, he walked calmly toward the aircraft. The crowd began to applaud again, louder this time. Not for the celebrity, but for the principle he'd just voiced. The senior officer followed, whispering apologies, promising disciplinary review, corporate follow-ups. But Steven didn't respond. He simply took his seat again in first class, quietly buckled in and closed his eyes as the engines hummed to life. Behind him, the whispers continued. Passengers nodded toward him with quiet admiration. And the man in the suit, the one who'd started it all, looked down, guilt carved into every line of his face. The tables had turned completely, not through anger or revenge, but through the calm power of truth. By the next morning, the world knew what had happened. Clips of the confrontation had spread across every social media platform: Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Millions had watched Steven Seagal remain calm while being humiliated, only to deliver one of the most composed and powerful messages ever caught on camera. Headlines blazed across news outlets. Steven Seagal removed from first class, responds with grace, not anger. Airline faces backlash after profiling incident. Seagal's words on respect go viral worldwide. By sunrise, the airline's official social media accounts were flooded with comments. Thousands demanded accountability. Hashtags like "try to respect for all," "shark Steven Seagal," and "end profiling" trended globally. The video, filmed by a teenage passenger, had been shared over 50 million times in less than 24 hours. Celebrities, athletes, and civil rights advocates reposted it, praising Seagal's restraint and humility. One comment read, The way he handled that says everything about his character. Strength isn't in shouting. It's in staying calm when the world expects you to explode. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, crisis meetings were underway. The CEO personally reached out to Steven's representatives, offering a public apology and a lifetime platinum membership. The statement released later that day read, "We deeply regret the incident involving Mr. Steven Seagal. Our crew's actions do not reflect our company's values of equality and respect. We are conducting a full internal investigation." But for Steven, none of that mattered as much as the message itself. That evening, he finally addressed the situation in a short, heartfelt video on his social media page. Wearing a simple black shirt, no theatrics, no filters, he looked straight into the camera. "I appreciate everyone's support," he began. "But this isn't about me. It's about how easily we judge others by what we see. By color, by clothes, by assumption. Respect should never depend on appearance or fame. It should be our default setting as human beings." He paused for a moment, his voice firm but reflective. "We can't change every system overnight, but we can start with how we treat the person in front of us. Whether they're a janitor, a CEO, or someone you don't recognize, they deserve your respect. That's all." The clip went viral instantly. Comments poured in from all over the world. People shared stories of being profiled or treated unfairly and thanked Steven for using his platform to speak up calmly, not angrily. A news anchor summarized it best that night. Steven Seagal didn't fight back with fists or fury. He fought back with dignity. And that's what truly made history. In the days that followed, the airline announced disciplinary action against the officer and introduced a new bias awareness training program for all staff. The businessman who demanded Steven's seat issued a personal apology through his lawyer, calling his behavior arrogant and regrettable. Steven didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. The world had already seen enough. A week later, at a charity event in Nevada, a reporter asked him if he forgave the people involved. He smiled slightly. "Of course," he said. "Holding on to anger just weighs you down. But forgetting? That's different. You forgive, but you remember, so you can make sure it doesn't happen again." That quote became another viral moment, printed on posters, shared in reels, captioned in hundreds of languages. And as the months passed, the story of that day turned into more than just an airport altercation. It became a symbol. A reminder that respect once lost can only be regained through humility. The same airline that once removed Steven Seagal from first class eventually invited him to speak at a global conference on equality in travel. He declined politely, saying only, "I've said what I needed to say. The rest is up to all of us." The world applauded the man who never raised his voice, because sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. If you believe that everyone deserves dignity and equality, no matter their race, fame, or background, type respect in the comments below.